I thought today with the last course or last class in the course, I'd talk you through sort of an overview of how this very nebulous topic called machine learning, specifically supervised machine learning, works. And I'll try to close by maybe, if there's time, discussing some of the differences between what I think of as traditional machine learning versus the new hotness, deep learning. I feel like if you could write a paper that integrates CRISPR-Cas9, COVID, and deep learning, you'd probably win a Nobel Prize just for buzzword usage. So I like to think about, I think the best example for thinking about supervised machine learning is handwriting recognition. So to set the stage, I want to talk about apparently what is the biggest personal check ever written, for $974 million. I understand this to be Harold G. Ham up in the upper left corner and Susan Ann Arnault were once married. They got divorced. This is a check that Harold G. Ham's trust wrote to Sue Ann Arnault's account to settle part of their divorce. Sad story, but an amazing check. And what's cool about this check, as you probably know, is that you can take that check and drive to an ATM, and you can stick that check into the ATM, and the ATM will recognize the digits, validate the account that's masked out here, and facilitate all the transfer of the money in the exact amount. Even in this situation where the 77 cents is kind of cut off, it's up in the upper right hand corner of the number entry spot, and part of it is actually into the border of the check. Now, we take this type of thing for granted, but if you think about it, it's a pretty amazing thing. I remember when this first came out, you could insert checks into the ATM rather than go to the bank. And for introverts, that's a really nice thing. You don't have to interact with anybody. You just stick it right in there and you got cash in your account. Pretty slick. Another example of this is the post office. When you submit, when a mall person comes by your house and grabs mail from your envelope, or you drop it off at the post office. I actually just did this a couple days ago. For pretty much any handwriting, it will recognize the address that's written, and figure out the street address, digitize it, figure out if you just give zip code, 5-digit zip code, it'll figure out the zip +4, the 9-digit zip code based upon the address, and everything. I mean, it's pretty amazing. And this person's handwriting is not great. Granted, this is a scanned image, but the handwriting is not amazing. So that also is incredibly, I think, absolutely amazing. It's something that the post office depends upon now. As you probably know, they run a pretty lean group at this point. They're not. I don't think they've been profitable for 30 years, and the number of postal carriers goes down every year. So they need as much as they can to sort of automate this. So automatically recognizing handwriting, converting it into an exact zip +5 is important, because that actually allows the post office to route those envelopes into individual bins. If you've ever worked in the post office or been in the post office, you see those big white bins, and that's what gets loaded onto a postal delivery truck, and that really streamlines the whole process. And the last example, which I think is really the most incredible, is the technology that's available on like a Microsoft Surface or an iPad now with the pencils. I use, I actually forget the name of the software now, some handwriting recognition software where I can take notes. And it will in real time, if I ask it to, translate my notes, and I have bad handwriting, especially with an Apple Pencil, into digitized text that is editable and searchable. And if you think about the range of quality of handwriting among just even all the people in our class, I'm probably at the low end. Some of you are probably at the high end. It has to, that's a huge amount of work to be able to detect that. So what we're going to focus on today is this technology that's referred to in the upper left of this. And it says, thanks to our powerful OCR technology. OCR stands for optical character recognition. Optical character recognition technology is machine learning. It is trying to look at what you wrote most recently, letter by letter or word by word, and infer or predict the word that you actually wrote. And for the most part, it does a darn good job. It makes mistakes for me frequently, especially with words that are written at weird angles because I've gotten lazy, or I tend to, at the end of a sentence, kind of trail off and not write as cleanly, and so it makes more mistakes there. But overall, it's pretty incredible and quite accurate. Okay, so how does this work? That's going to be the focus of this lecture. And optical character recognition, as I said, is a machine learning, a supervised machine learning technology. And we're going to talk about how that works. Okay, so there's so-called unsupervised machine learning, and there's supervised machine learning. An example of unsupervised machine learning is linear regression. We have an independent variable and we have a dependent variable. We're trying to figure out what that regression line is, that essentially the slope and the intercept. It is machine learning because once we have that model and we believe that it's a statistically significant model, then we can, as we talked about before, we can predict future values that we've never seen. So we've trained or taught, or the machine has learned. It is unsupervised because there's no classification. We basically gave it two variables and made it fit a trend. In contrast, supervised machine learning is typically a more complicated form of machine learning where we have to help the machine learn. We have to guide it, and that's the supervision. And the way we guide machine learning, as is depicted in this example, is by providing examples to the machine and labels. So for instance, if we were Google and 15 years ago, we were trying to be able to predict what the content of all these images are that are on the internet, so that if we wanted to develop a technology for image search is the result of a trained machine learning technique. And that is the result of people providing a lot of examples on the y-axis here of different types of images. So the first column is a bunch of different planes. We got cars and birds and trucks and et cetera. And you can tell that each of these images are normalized in a certain way, in the sense that the image of interest, the trucks and the dogs and the birds and the planes, are all rather centered in the image. So the person that has curated this so-called training set to teach the machine has actually spent a fair amount of time selecting images that are germane to the problem, that are informative, and they've cropped out all the junk, the noise in the images. And this is important so that, Google image search can take, maybe for the example of the first horse, that's a nice looking horse that seems to be trotting along the fence. But if you zoom out, that picture might actually be, there might be a backhoe in the background and a house and a couple of horse lovers nearby, etc. So you'd want the machine to be able to take a larger image and actually figure out all the different components. So if it was trained on to recognize houses and people and backhoes and horses, it could take a larger image and figure out all the different things that are in it. And another example of this that I find awfully scary sometimes is when you if you're using an iPhone or an Android, most of the software now, if you ask it to, it will recognize people that are the faces of people that are in your pictures, so that, you know, if I want to find all the pictures of my little brother Connor, I can just go into my phone and type Connor in the image thing, and it will, sure enough, it will not only find all the recent pictures of him, but it'll go back and find pictures from his childhood that are on my phone that I never took with the iPhone. So it's pretty powerful technology, right? So that was a bit of a tangent, but the main point here is that supervised machine learning requires many examples, and that for each of the examples you give it a label, so it can learn essentially the features in images that are indicative of a dog versus a deer versus a cat. So that is on the upper end of difficulty with supervised machine learning. We're going to focus on how we can use supervised machine learning examples and labels to be able to detect handwriting.
Hey, Aaron, I have a question.
Yes.
So when you were talking about cropping the image and making sure that it only featured like the animal, in this case of interest, does that how does that not like lead to overfitting? Like how would then it still be able to recognize like those features in maybe like a more complicated image?
Yep, that's a great question. So this setup, this very, you know, intentionally toy example here, is actually more of a subset of what you'd really do to train something as complicated as Google image search. So what this would be able to do is, given a normalized image like this, be able to predict with high accuracy. It would struggle with just these training examples to figure out in a more complicated image that involves lots of different things, like a beach at Fort Lauderdale right now or something, and actually partition that into its constituent pieces. But what you can do is then provide more and more examples, which get ever more complicated, where you have a larger chunk of an image where you tell it that it has item X and item Y, so a dog and a cat or things like that. Now, there's an infinite number of possibilities there, so you can't provide an example for everything. But you're right that it can both lead to overfitting and underfitting in a more general case of trying to find all the things that are in an image. But I guess I would say that there are techniques to get around that problem by providing different types of examples in different contexts. It's a little bit out of the scope of actually my knowledge and my experience, but there are definitely tried and true techniques for that. It's essentially just giving fuzzier and fuzzier examples. Okay, ultimately, this comes back to Bayes' rule, because what you're ultimately asking is, what is the probability of some class A given an image? You're given an image and you want to predict the class that it belongs to once you've trained something. So this gets back, I mean, I know we covered Bayes' rule a while ago, and we got another slide to walk through this in more detail. But ultimately, if we can estimate if we can measure the probability of all these different components that go into Bayes' rule, we can actually use that to make high confidence predictions about what we're seeing. I mean, a really stupid example of this would be, let's maybe say there's an image of a Chihuahua that, to me, from if the perspective was right and we weren't quite sure about how close the object were, it might look like some other dog. I don't know what a Chihuahua looks most close to, but if we were confused about how far it was away, we might not realize that it's actually a small dog and predict that it's some type of other other dog. But there might be some, it might be almost equally likely that you predict that it's a Chihuahua or this other breed that is similar in its characteristics. Bayes' rule will help us to evaluate the most likely class, whether it's Chihuahua or some other breed, given the information that we have. Okay, so just to walk through another example of how Bayes' rule works, let's just imagine that we've got these behind a curtain. The truth is there's two bins. One bin has, the first bin has 3 black balls and 2 white balls, and the second bin has 2 white balls and 1 black ball. Some magician reaches behind the screen, pulls out a ball from one of the 2 bins. We don't know, but we know what the contents of the 2 bins are. We're given that information. Magician pulls out the ball, shows it to us, and we have to say, and he shows, and it turns out it's a white ball. And we know that there were 2 white balls in bin 1, 3 black balls in bin 1, 2 white balls in bin 2, and 1 black ball in bin 2. If he shows us that white ball, we can actually take that information to make our best guess as to which bin that white ball came from. Okay, and this is, I realize it's a bit out there, but it's kind of the same idea. We're shown some image, or the computer is shown some image, and it has to use the same kind of logic to figure out what the most likely image type is. So this just breaks down into what's on the bottom here, what's the probability of bin 1, given that it's a white ball, and that can be flipped around of what's the probability of a white ball given bin 1, and that's what, 2 out of 5, times the probability of bin 1, well, that's 5 out of 8. 5 of the balls, total balls, are in bin 1, divided by the probability of a white ball. Well, that's 4 out of 8, 0.5. Okay, simple example, but assuming that we can measure these probabilities, these prior probabilities accurately, we can use Bayes' rule to make good predictions. Now, measuring those prior probabilities accurately depends upon this whole supervision part of the machine learning. Like, we need to give lots of good examples, both positive and negative, and we really need to have good labels associated with all those examples. Okay, so getting back to the main point, we're going to talk about a subset of handwriting classification called digit classification. So basically just recognizing these numbers 0 through 9 that not all the world uses, but a large proportion of the world uses. And so let's imagine that we are trying to train the earliest iPad app to recognize numbers that are written by an individual. So it turns out that this problem is actually a fundamental problem in teaching people machine learning techniques at the undergraduate and graduate level. And to facilitate that training and teaching and method development, a group has put together this data set called MNIST. I forget what the acronym stands for, but essentially it's a massive collection of numbers that have been written by people using, like pen technology that's been around for like signing credit cards and stuff like that forever. And so what I'm showing here is two rows of examples of the numbers 0 through 9 written by 2 different individuals. And again, what you'll notice is that each of these numbers has been normalized in the way that I talked about in the object slide with lots of different examples, such that the number is, as best possible, centered in this 28 by 28 pixel square. So each of these, this is actually a higher resolution one, but the basic version of MNIST is each square consists of 28 pixels across and 28 pixels up. And what you can tell is that for each of these images, the vast majority of it is black, because it has information. There is no information. There was nothing related to the number that was written by the individual. But certain pixels are lit up when the person is, for instance, a 2. You can see this trace of the pixels that are lit up by writing the number 2. And if you compare the two examples for number 2, they're actually quite different. I would say that the bottom 2 is is hard to tell. That's hard to tell, I think, for some people, that's actually a 2. The top one is clearer. And then I don't know how you guys write 7s, but I was taught to write a 7 with a line through the middle of it, a horizontal line through the middle of it. That's sort of what I think of as a European 7. And 1s I make with a little tilde at the top, so it kind of looks like a 7. So this variation in the way people write different numbers, in the U.S. or regionally, or from individual to individual, or from Europe to South America to North America, that represents the inherent challenge for a machine learning technology or optical character recognition to actually properly interpret what was written by the individual. So some 1s with that little tilde, like how I make it, might actually look like very close to a 7 that other people make. 3s and 8s, you could imagine, like this bottom 3, to me looks awfully close to potentially an 8, imagining that the individual sort of lifted the pen at that last little, let's see, is that right? Yeah, that last stroke, if you're right-handed. So how does the machine figure out how to what's the most likely character that was written? And that's what we're going to focus on. I want to say that also, just draw a quick analogy to biology, because I know we're a little bit far from biology, but the same thing is done now. You're probably familiar with a paper that I'm going to touch upon in the last slide, which maybe 2 years ago, I think it was a group from Stanford, published a paper saying, well, radiologists, you really should be worried about your jobs, because this machine learning technique that we have can take a chest scan, X-ray scan, and basically say, yeah, there's an infection, or there's a tumor in there, with the same accuracy as a trained radiologist. And so the training of that, that led to a lot of controversy, and it turns out they're probably not quite right yet. Ideally, we would have some sort of prediction like that to sort of automate things, but it would still require some doctor confirmation. But that technology that was developed at Stanford used a similar process. They gave a lot of negative examples, so chest X-rays with nothing wrong, where it looks clear as day, and then a lot of examples where a pathologist had actually said, or radiologist, sorry, had actually said, yes, there is something wrong here, and they'll circle it. And so that leads to the training, so that the machine can actually figure out whether or not an image has anything wrong with it. The same thing is done in genomics all the time to find features in the genome. So machine learning is used to find things like CPG islands in the genome. You can give a bunch of examples of, yeah, here's a nucleotide sequence that does have a CPG island in it. Here's another sequence that doesn't. And you can do that with lots and lots of examples, and it will not only recognize, the machine will, if you think about what the machine is actually learning, it's going to learn 2 things if you're trying to predict sequences that have CPG islands. 1, GC content is probably one of the signals it's going to be picking up on. And then 2, this not only high GC content, but a cytosine followed by a guanine over and over again in the sequence. So there are lots of different approaches to using machine learning. There's things like support vector machines and neural networks and a thing called naive Bayes classifiers, and there's random forests and all these things. But those are actually just different mathematical models. They all use the same concept of providing lots of examples and labels associated with those examples. And the machine is trained to like basically dissect what is the signal in those different examples that differentiates, in this case, nines from ones or CPG islands from non-CPG islands. Okay. So moving on. So one thing that could be done, just as a straw man here, one thing that could be done to model digits for a classifier would be to actually track where the individual started and the curvature and the pressure and the whole shape, like basically figuring out these blue points are where pressure started and was ended, and then the red lines are the curvature. So that works actually really well, looking at the changes in angles and the curves and all these things. But it turns out to be very complicated. It's difficult to train a model that works generally across lots of different handwriters using an approach like this. This would be sort of on the extreme end of sophistication. So I use that to set up potentially a simpler way. And that is what I think of as this probabilistic approach. Okay, so what we can do, we will collect, let's say we have this MNIST data set, which probably a bunch of grad students and postdocs spent a long time curating by getting handwriting from, let's say, 1,000 individuals. They had 1,000 individuals write the numbers 0 through 9, and then they normalized all these images. So essentially what they've got is 1,000 zeros, 1,000 ones, 1,000 twos, all in these normalized images. So the probabilistic approach for doing this is if they can take each of those images and look at the pixels, there's 28 by 28 pixels in each of those images. For each of those pixels, they can ask how often is this pixel illuminated, non-black, when the image is a 1? How often is this pixel illuminated when this image is a 2, or a 3, or a 4, or a 5, or a 6, or a 7, or 8, or a 9? Because remember, they have labels. They know that this was the 0 that individual wrote, the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4. So that leads to a lot of information, actually. So I've got to figure out how to get my pointer here. Bear with me a second. Annotate. Yeah. Sorry, guys. I've used this darn thing so many times and I still can't use it right. Well, any Keynote gurus that know how to turn on the spotlight in Keynote?
You're so annoyed with me.
Oh well. I'm gonna have to wing it. I'll just talk. So someone's unmuted and we can hear some background noise.
It looks like you can do it in preferences, and slideshow, and interacting section.
In Keynote?
Yeah, in Keynote, preferences and slideshow.
I'll try that. Thank you, Simone. Do you see that? My pointer? Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, better. All right, so imagine, so what I ended on before I got lost in Pointerland is that some of these pixels are actually very informative with respect to what number that was written actually is. So imagine for a 2, a lot of people start in the upper left-hand corner and are, and this way. So probably it looks to me like these pixels and these pixels out here, if they're lit up, are potentially informative that, hey, this might be a 2. But also if you write a 3, it usually starts up there. But so if there's just contrast with like this pixel right here, if the pixel's lit up, I would say it's probably not a 1. It's potentially a 3. That's some information that's a 3. Potentially the information that's a 2. Maybe a 4, thinking through the numbers. I don't know. I can't go through all of them. But so that each pixel has some information about what potential number that was written is. 1 pixel alone is not enough. But we've got 28 times 28 pixels. That's a big number. It's bigger than 400. It's less than 900. It's like probably 700 something. So that's a lot of pixels. So basically the approach is to combine the information across all those. What is 28 times 28? Anyone know? Can someone tell me? That'll drive me nuts. It can take all the information from all those 28 by 28 pixels to make the best guess, integrating all the information from all those pixels. And
784.
What is it?
784.
784. Okay. So I was close. So 784 pixels, and that the information content in each of those 784 pixels is what is the probability of that pixel being lit up if the image is a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4, and that all comes from Bayes' rule, because for each image we have a label, and we can ask whether or not that pixel was lit up for that image. So we can say across all 1s, what's the probability of the upper left-hand corner pixel being lit up? I would say that's very close to 0. For the probability of this center pixel being lit up, if the image is a 1, is very close to 1. It looks like pretty much all images that center pixel is lit up, because most people write a 1 almost vertically or slightly at an angle, depending on if you're left or right-handed. Okay. Right. So we can make this a little bit simpler. In the previous images, these lit up pixels are a bit on grayscale. It's black or super white if you pressed really hard in a particular spot, and lighter if it's if you were a little bit lighter on the pencil. But what we can do is binarize all these pixels. And what I mean is, if it's non-black, if there's any intensity at all, turn it bright white. So then we basically, what's the probability that's on or off at a particular pixel, given that it's a 5 or a 4 or a 3 or a 2 or a 1, etc. Whereas if we don't binarize, it's a little trickier, because we have to say what's the probability that it's some value between 0 and 1, where 0 is totally black and 1 is totally white. So binarizing makes the problem a little bit easier. You lose some information there, because maybe the fact that it gets a little bit light when people sweep around the corner when making an 8 is actual extra information that could be useful. But let me just say that binarizing works quite well. Okay, so these images, as I said, are 28 by 28 pixels. So what ends up happening is they break up this image into this grid. And now here's an example concretely of what the tool is doing. For every image and every label, in this case, the label is 1, it's saying, oh, all these pixels on the outside are 0, and all these here are 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, etc. And so after looking at lots of 1s, 1,000 1s, 1,000 2s, 1,000 3s, we can say for every pixel in this 28 by 28 grid, 784 pixels, we have a list of 784 pixels. And for each of those pixels, we have a probability of that pixel being black for when people wrote a 1, when people wrote a 2, when people wrote a 3. And that probability literally comes from how many times out of 1,000 that pixel was lit up when it was a 1, when it was a 2, when it was a 3, etc. Okay? So this is what this gets converted to in a matrix. It's a matrix of zeros and ones, approximately. Profile lots of examples, as I said. You get lots of zeros, lots of ones, and you have this really well calibrated data set. And ultimately, what you have, this is a heat map of what a trained model would look like. So the redder the pixel, the more frequently that pixel was lit up across all the 1,000 examples, say. So for example, and the bluer the pixel, the least frequently. So for instance, this in all the 1,000 examples of the number 1 that was written, this upper left-hand pixel is very cold blue. It was never lit up. In this, right in the center here, the most of the time the pixels were lit up. And there's a little bit of noise sort of flanking left and right of this, and I think that comes from when people write a 1, sometimes one angle versus another. And I would say that the people that they hired to write these numbers were more right-handed than left-handed, because that 1 is kind of sloping a little bit at an angle that's indicative of a right-hander. And most of these numbers are actually leaning a little bit to the right, suggesting, not surprisingly, that there's a right-hand bias. But what I want to emphasize is that this is literally a picture, a heat map of the model that was trained. And that model, you can think of these intensities, these color intensities, as those prior probabilities that go into Bayes' rule. This is, we've got, for each of those pixels, the intensity is the number of times it was lit up over the 1,000 examples that were observed. Now, if we collected 10,000 or 100,000 examples, maybe this model would be a little better trained. But just looking at this, let's say it was 1,000 individuals, it's pretty well trained, because you can see the basic trend of each of the numbers, but you can also see some of the noise or the uncertainty. So let me just pick out one example here. So this pixel right here, you can tell is actually not all that informative, because if you look across, that pixel is lit up quite a bit for all 2s, quite a bit for all 3s, quite a bit for 5s, 8s, 9s, and 7s. So seeing that pixel is lit up in a new image that we've never seen before, let's say, pick on someone in the class, let's say Sarah comes in and writes a number, and on a new iPad, and that iPad has to predict it. It's going to look at that first pixel that I showed, and it's going to say, well, that doesn't tell me too much. But then let's say we see this pixel out here is lit up. Well, I think that might eliminate an 8. It makes it less likely that what Sarah wrote was an 8. It probably makes it somewhat likely that it was a 3. Probably not so much a 5. I think you get my point. But we can integrate that uncertainty across all 784 pixels. And that actually, the end result is that you get a really well calibrated probability for each of the 9 letters. So we can predict, using Bayes' rule, the probability that given this image, its class is 0, its class is 1, its class is 2, its class is 3, all the way to 9. Okay, so that's essentially what we're doing. We get all these different bins of numbers, and we get prior probabilities for each of these pixels. and we can plug in Bayes' rule to, let's say this was, now let's pick on Sarah again. Let's say this is what she wrote. It's a nice looking 5. It can use, this is the unseen example, and we can predict what this is. The machine can predict what this is based upon the trained model. So we can say, what is the probability that the class is J, where J ranges from 0 to 9, given the image X? So we have to predict that probability using Bayes' rule for 0s and 1s and 2s and 3s. So how does that work? On the left are the prior probabilities for each of the different numbers. And this looks roughly uniform. There are 10 different numbers. So the prior is like, okay, essentially that every number has an equal likelihood of being written by some random individual. But you can see that 1s are a little more common. 5s aren't quite as common. A uniform probability for 10 numbers would be 0.1 for each. And I guess 1 is probably, I'm not sure why that would be a little bit higher. Yeah, I don't know. But these are the empirical prior probabilities. People tend to write 1s a little bit more than they write a 5. So those are the priors that go into Bayes' rule. But then the key bit of Bayes' rule, because remember the priors are on the denominator and the second component of the numerator. The first component of the numerator is flipping around the probability that it belongs to class J given X. You flip that around to say, well, what's the probability of this image given class 0 or 1 or 2 or 3? And that's where this model comes in. We estimate we measure the probability of that image given coming from a certain class by looking at all the pixels that are lit up in Sarah's drawing of a 5 across all this trained model. Okay, and so at the end of the day, what integrating across all those 784 pixels, along with these priors, tells us is that the most probable class that this 5 belongs to is not surprisingly a 5. Now, this model and this is taken right from the MNIST website, the trained model that they have predicts that the second most likely number that Sarah wrote is a 4. I don't quite see that in the trained model. I would have guessed honestly that it was 8 would be the second most likely, but if you see their model, it actually says that that's actually way down the list. And there's probably just some information in that trained model that I can't pick out by eye. But ultimately, so what's going to happen is if she's writing on her iPad and this is the trained model that the iPad is using, it's going to, and she's asking it to convert it to text that can be searched later on, it's going to make that a 5. And in that case, it would be right, but maybe sometimes it makes mistakes. And it's when it'll make mistakes when the probability of 2 different numbers is really close to one another, and it turns out that the wrong one is slightly higher than the right one, and so it'll guess wrong. Thankfully, these OCR, optical character recognition technologies, are really well trained, because they not only have not 1,000 individuals writing this, but Apple probably spent a lot of time figuring this out. Another example is, another thing that's often done is actually doing customized training for the user. So my daughter last week taught me how to tell my iPhone to say, "Hey Siri," so I didn't have to like hold the button or something. And I'd never done that before. And actually what it does is it has you say it a bunch of different times, so it can learn the properties of how you say Hey Siri versus somebody else, so that it only recognizes your voice and no one else's. You can do the same thing apparently with Microsoft Surface. You can give it examples of your handwriting, so it does a better job with your specific style of writing. Okay, so I walked through this already. This is the most this is the posterior, this is the class that maximizes the posterior probability. There are 10 different posterior probabilities. This is the highest. And so, you know, the equation form of this is a function called argmax, which is basically the maximum across all these different posteriors. It's also, if you want to get into the wonky terminology here, it's also known as the MAP estimator or the maximum a posteriori estimator, but it's basically just it's a complicated way of saying the most probable prediction given the model. So if you think about what we really talked about mostly was the training the model, but I think it's also important to think about, once you've trained a model, what's actually happening behind the scenes to leverage the model. And this, so for instance, I on my iPad write my 2, looks like I make a loop, and what automatically conceptually could be happening behind the scenes is it tries to create a bounding box that encompasses what I just drew and rescales it such that the image that it's going to feed into the classifier is normalized in exactly the same way as all the images that were used to train the classifier. Once it's been rescaled, then essentially it can just be fed into that model so that it can use Bayes' rule in the way that I just described. And this approach is called a naive Bayes approach. Everything we just walked through of using Bayes' rule in the way that I just said is called a naive Bayes approach. And this is a point of confusion, was a point of confusion for me for a long time, until I had a bit of an epiphany about this. And the reason it's a naive approach is because Bayes' rule really assumes that every piece of information that goes into computing that posterior probability is independent of all other pieces of information. But in the case of handwriting, in this example, many supervised machine learning techniques, that assumption is violated, because the probability of this pixel being lit up is not independent of the probability of the pixel to the left being lit up. If I wrote a 1, obviously there is some dependence across the pixels because of the fact that I wrote a 1. What's really slick about the naive Bayes approach is that despite the fact that it is naive, it assumes this independence that is actually violated all the time. Nonetheless, it works really, really well for a lot of classification approaches. So we've used naive Bayes classifiers in the lab all the time. A postdoc of mine used a naive Bayes approach to take nucleotide sequences that came off of an Oxford nanopore MinION to actually predict the pathogen from which those nucleotide sequences came. So connecting that back to everything that we just talked about, if you think about it, how did that work? So the way we went about training that classifier, so you give it any k-mer of size 21 or more, so 21 nucleotide k-mers or more, it will tell you the most likely critter from which that k-mer came. And if you have lots and lots of k-mers, 21 mers, so thousands of them, that prediction gets better and better. So the way we train that was by taking the reference genome of lots of different pathogens, shredding them up into 21 mers, and each of those 21 mers was an example, training example, and each of those 21 mers had a label, which was which critter that 21 mer belonged to. Now, many 21 mers, 21 nucleotide sequences, will be present in every critter, so they're not informative. But the notion here is that some 21 mers will be highly informative about not only the species from which the sequence came, but also the particular strain. And so the thing that we were most excited about is that it was actually able to confidently predict whether nucleotide sequences came from a lab-derived or a wild strain of anthrax. That was one of the motivations it was based upon, that we developed that as part of a potential government contract for classifiers. So it's the same strategy. You basically have examples, which in that case were k-mers. In this case, it's pixels, or 784 pixels at a time, and you have labels. And the reason that k-mer prediction algorithm was naive is similar to this. A 21 mer like, I think you can see me, 21 mer like this, and the overlapping 21 mer, so staggered 7 nucleotides down, they're not independent of one another. They overlap. But nonetheless, the classification scheme, given that the naivete of the model, works quite well. Okay, so I talked about this at the end, and I'm just going to touch upon maybe a couple other examples. Did I get this right? Yeah, it's from Stanford. This is the paper. Andrew Inge, the second author here, is sort of a guru of machine learning. If you type machine learning, learning machine learning into Google, chances are you'll find his class at Stanford high on the list. And ultimately, what they were trying to do is, take chest scans like this and find out whether or not there's any anomalies in the scan. To hopefully, looks like there's a question. Hold on a second. All right, Emily asks, at what point would the model you talked about to identify DNA sequence fail if the new DNA sequence was not from one of the species in the training set? Yeah, it would fail miserably. It would not know what to do with it. So basically, it would say if it was not seen in any of those sets, then the probability of it being in any of those sets is 0. So it wouldn't do anything. That is super naive, because it could be that there was a sequencing error, and that k-mer that it gave, that you gave it, was actually just one nucleotide different than a k-mer that belongs to, say, a lab-derived strain of anthrax. And so it's a stupid model. It wouldn't know that. So the way you can model that is to actually account for sequencing error. So I lied a little bit about how we trained that model. We not only took the nucleotide sequence for the reference genome of each of these strains and broke that up into k-mers. We also did, I think, 10,000 simulations of perturbing, mutating that genome, following the known error rate and error profile of the technology that was going to be used to provide raw sequencing data as k-mers for prediction, and that helps get around that problem. Good question. Right. So machine learning is used all over the place in biology. Everything from predicting CPG islands or genes in the genome, or predicting, for instance, there's actually a really cool method which uses bisulfite sequencing to predict the age of an individual. So basically, there was a really beautiful paper from about a decade ago that said that, I think it's methylation in CPG dinucleotide methylation increases as we age, and the number of methylated dinucleotides, if I'm getting this right, is a really good, that you measure in blood, is a really good proxy for age. The correlation coefficient was something like 0.8 for that. So for every additional dinucleotide that's methylated, maybe that adds like a month to the predicted age. So there are models now where you can actually just do bisulfite sequencing of blood and predict age, which is, you can imagine, useful for forensic reasons. Okay, the last thing that I want to touch on, check my time here. Oops. All right, in 3 minutes, I'm going to tell you one quick story or one quick anecdote about the difference between deep learning and machine learning. Okay, so deep learning gets a lot of press. It's now being lumped in, like basically everyone talks about AI and deep learning, and AI has really come to mean essentially anything that uses computers, which is a bit unfortunate. But you notice that this paper talks about deep learning for chest radiographs. So the distinction between deep learning and machine learning fundamentally is the following. In the previous example of handwriting classification, which is not deep learning, we are telling and providing the machine with exactly the features that we have determined are going to be relevant to its learning. And those features in this case were those 784 pixels. The data we give it is that vector of, or that list of 784 pixels, and that's the only information it has. And it's got a label associated with those. Deep learning is reserved for problems where human intuition about what the salient features in the data are is limited. Like we almost want we want to give some basic guidance to the model about what is a relevant feature, but we want the technique to be sophisticated enough that it can essentially figure out what the salient features are in the data on its own. And that the most widely used version of deep learning to do that is something called a convolutional neural network. And the convolution is essentially thinking of, trying to think about how to explain that in a simple term. Let's say you have a picture of the Mona Lisa, and the full information is the whole picture. But if you took a square every 1 inch, take a square, skip an inch, take another square from that picture, skip an inch, and so on. And then you take all those sub squares from the image and compress them down into, and use those to compose a new mosaic of the original Mona Lisa that is half the size of the original because we sampled every other inch. You'd still be able to pick out that was a picture of an individual, but there's some fuzziness to it. So convolutional neural networks take that kind of approach of just sort of randomly manipulating or perturbing the data that you're given to basically learn more higher level features or structure in the examples so that it can figure out what the most informative features in the data are to make these predictions. I know that's a bit abstract, but it's highly effective for really, really difficult prediction problems. The downside of deep learning is that it can take years to train really good models that are effective. And the thing that's not talked about a lot is there's a lot of human intervention to sort of tweak these models such that they don't spend the heat death of the universe trying to figure out the optimal combinations of features in the data to make the best predictions. So deep learning is a hot topic in genomics and in medicine. It has some mixed results. I don't know of any really striking new methods for biology or medicine other than sort of these simple chest scans and brain scans, which arguably could be done even without deep learning. So I apologize for the delay. I went a little bit long. This is the last class, so I just want to thank all of you for sticking it out, given all the